you will hear that constant ringing noise there. Terry is recording. Thanks everybody for being back to another climate change seminar. We have Jakob here from the Mercator Institute and the Eco Institute in both in Germany. He's a very well-known environmental and resource economist, and you will see, of course, that he's doing a lot of interesting work on distributional impacts of climate policies, which is a really big topic these days. And I should point out that it's 7 p.m. his time, so I don't know if you had dinner already, Michael, but you did. Okay, good. All right, so without much ado, thank you very much for being here, and it's all yours.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. So what I want to do is to not focus on one particular paper and not go into so much methodological detail, but give you a very broad overview of recent work on distributional issues that has been undertaken, and mostly what we have done at the MCC. So actually my colleagues from the working group Climate and Development have built up a research agenda and the infrastructure to look at distribution of climate policies from different angles. And basically where we're coming from for a long time is actually asking questions about actually how climate change mitigation can be reconciled with socioeconomic development. So in order to prevent that, actually the poor would need to have to pay the price for preventing climate change. So what I want to do first is say a very few words about carbon pricing, then something about distribution impacts of carbon prices, discuss revenue recycling, and then say a little bit about some very recent research we have undertaken regarding substitution effects. So if you have a carbon price, people would adapt to that, and yeah, you can expect certain interesting effects. And then at the end, I will discuss very briefly some emerging issues related to horizontal equity, alternative policy instruments other than carbon pricing, and implications of regional disparities. So different distribution impacts across, for instance, federal states. And then quickly just wrap it up with some conclusions. So let's start off with carbon pricing. Of course, you all know from the textbook that carbon pricing is the most economically efficient, the most promising tool to implement a cost-efficient climate policy, to actually internalize the social cost of carbon, such that the market would actually provide the right incentives. And this is not only, actually carbon pricing has been considered for quite some time as some kind of economist fancy that this is maybe in the textbook, but it doesn't really work in reality. But more and more carbon pricing schemes are coming up, and actually more research is being undertaken, actually showing the effectiveness of carbon pricing. So this is from a quite nice study that our Australian colleagues, Best and Paul Berg, and I don't know if Frank Grazzo was also involved, but he's like the guy, Frank Grazzo was also co-author. They actually looked at, okay, how did countries' emission develop for countries that had a carbon price versus countries that didn't have a carbon price. So left-hand side, right-hand side, and you see that those countries that had a carbon price had, in the years 97 to 2007, almost no growth of emissions, and then a very negative, at least a decline of 2% per year in the period 2007 to 2017. So of course you could argue that correlation is not causation, that actually there might be other issues. The carbon price hasn't caused this. But if you look at, for instance, what's happening in Germany, coal is driven out of the market simply because carbon prices are quite high. They're about 40 euros, so $45 at the moment. That actually makes coal uncompetitive, and you don't actually need a lot of additional regulation. Yes, Terry, would you like to?
Well, yes, sorry. The biggest. Well, I was curious. What's the set of countries? Are these all like OECD countries, or this is because I would worry if it's
all countries on which they could have data from. That's like this World Bank carbon pricing dashboard.
Because what happens if you regress it on income of the country? Because poorer countries are rapidly growing emissions, while rich countries are the ones with carbon prices.
I think they do control for income.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I can send you the study if you want, or the link.
Sure, yeah.
So actually, there are quite a lot of carbon prices, but of course, these carbon prices are way too low. If you can look at the right carbon price from two perspectives. One is like the so-called social cost of carbon perspective, to actually try to put some monetary value on climate damages. And there actually estimates, I mean, you get a huge ballpark of estimates depending on many, many assumptions, but something in the area of like $100 per ton of carbon is like in the middle of these estimates. And also in the so-called cost effectiveness mode, to ask, okay, what carbon price would we need to achieve like 2 degree or the 1.5 degree target? You get ranges like something between 40 and $100, like the Stiglitz-Stern estimates. And if you look at the distribution of carbon pricing, like this bluish area here, you see that only about 10% of global emissions are priced at the social costs or above. So that's mostly actually fuel taxes. In many countries, like for instance, Sweden is a good example. They have a CO2 price on fuel of like 100 euros per ton of CO2. And of course, that's not only climate measures, it's also to create revenues. Yeah, carbon pricing is expanding across many countries. So of course, European ETS was one prime example, California, RGGI, but also less developed countries are more and more moving towards carbon pricing. So South Africa has implemented a carbon tax. China is using some pilot schemes and going towards full emission trading. So there's actually some leeway to expand carbon pricing across the globe and hopefully also raise the level of ambition using carbon prices. Perhaps also using some international mechanisms to help capacity building, to help actually cover the costs, the economic costs of the carbon price, and so on. And actually, the good thing about carbon pricing, that's in my view often underappreciated, that it not only provides the right incentives, but it creates revenues. And of course, revenues are something that states and in particular finance ministries who are very powerful really like. So for many states, actually, the revenue motive could be one of the most important drivers to actually implement a carbon price. And this could also be a very important aspect for poor countries, because for many poor countries, they have huge financing needs to actually build up infrastructure, education, healthcare, and so on. But it's not so easy to raise taxes because many things that are quite common in OECD countries, like labor taxes or value-added taxes, are administratively not that easy to implement. And many countries are actually using tariffs on trade as a source of revenue, but that's highly inefficient because you actually cut off your supply of machinery, of things you would like to have. And if you could switch to carbon pricing, this could actually be a more economically efficient source of income, not even taking into account the climate externalities. And also what's important, that many countries have a quite high share of the informal sector. And of course, you cannot tax the informal sector directly, but they also use energy. And if you tax the carbon, you also tax the energy that's used in informal activities. So this might also be an advantage. We've done a study here that look in how far could the revenues of carbon pricing meet the financing gaps for the Sustainable Development Goals. So actually, there are some estimates what kind of money you would need in particular countries to meet all Sustainable Development Goals. So be it food security, be it education, healthcare, access to infrastructure like electricity, sanitation, and so on and so on. And then to get a sense of the carbon pricing revenues, we used emissions and carbon prices from integrated assessment models. Like for the IPCC, they collect all these scenarios. And we just took like the medium range there. Of course, there's a huge range of emissions and in particular carbon prices because models work in very different ways. And we assume that this is only the domestic revenues. So if each country implemented the globally optimal carbon price, which of course would be quite high, how far could they use the revenues? To what extent could they actually finance their sustainable development goal. And the bluer it gets, the more you can actually finance. So for countries in Asia, you find that some could even entirely cover their SDG needs by terms of carbon pricing, or also in India, like they could finance between 60 and 100%. That's due to several facts. I mean, first, emissions are higher than, for instance, in Africa, which means more revenues. And on the other hand, access gaps are smaller. And for Africa, of course, it would be, for many countries, the revenues would be quite marginal. At the same time, the financing gaps would be much more pronounced. So we're not actually proposing that this is like the silver bullet to heal all the world's problems, but it quite nicely illustrates that you could actually combine climate change mitigation and socioeconomic development. So let's come to the distribution implications, which is the basic issue of this talk. Firstly, we wanted to know what's in the literature. And if you look at the literature on distribution implications of carbon pricing, it seems a bit confusing because you get so many different results. I mean, some people say, okay, carbon pricing is always regressive, but then you look at studies that find progressive effects. And then you ask yourself, okay, why is that? And studies look at different countries, they look at different policies. So some studies look at economy-wide carbon pricing, some look at carbon pricing only in particular sectors. Some people say, okay, carbon pricing is regressive, but fossil fuel subsidy reform is progressive, because most studies on subsidy reform find progressive impacts. So it seems confusing that why is it, if you abolish a subsidy, progressive, but if you put the taxes, it's regressive? And we actually did a meta review. So one of our PhD students, Niels Ollendorf, did a structured assessment of the literature. So he used a query, including keywords like carbon pricing, distribution, incidence, and so on, and actually screened the studies and took out only those that actually estimated some kind of distribution effect. So we ended up with 53 studies, and those usually estimate more than one effect. So at the end, we had like 183 effects. And then what he did, that he performed a kind of multinomial logit regression. So the dependent variable is whether the carbon pricing or subsidy reform scheme is progressive, neutral, or regressive. And he uses different variables to explain, including the income of the country, the kind of policy, whether it's a subsidy or a transport policy, the kind of model, whether it's like a static model, a CGE model, or a kind of model, empirical assessment, but that takes into account substitution effects. And also controls for publication type, whether it's a journal publication or a working paper. And what's interesting, actually, that here, the further on the left you are, this means that you're more likely to find progressive results. And that actually for poorer countries, you're more likely to find progressive results, keeping everything else constant. And this is not so surprising because in most poor countries, the poorest members of society don't use that much energy. I mean, very poor people in, let's say, sub-Saharan Africa or South America usually don't own cars. They have very few appliances. It's more like the emerging middle class and the upper class that actually is more affected. And this turns for richer countries, because there, even the relatively poor people have those luxury goods. And the richer you get, you consume more energy, but not in proportion to your income. So if you're twice as times richer than the average, you usually don't consume twice as much energy, because you spend more like on high quality goods and services and so on. So this is important, that actually we can also estimate some kind of turning point. And that's like a per capita GDP of around $10,000 US, where actually you switch from regressive to progressive. Then also interesting here, the policies we find for transport policies, if you only apply carbon pricing on transport, not economy-wide, you're more likely to get progressive outcomes. which of course is again this car ownership issue. You're more likely to find progressive results if you take into account models that allow for more flexibility. Like if people are allowed to substitute for the out of energy use, they're more likely to actually be able to kind of, the poor people are more willing actually to substitute out of energy use. Richer people will actually keep up their consumption. And what's also interesting, the subsidy issue is totally insignificant. So subsidy removal is simply more progressive because energy subsidies are much more prevalent in poor countries. And the actually the income can explain the whole effect. So it's no difference whether you remove a subsidy or you impose a carbon price. It's just the subsidy removal occurs in poor countries. We also did, like, as a companion paper, so to say, another PhD student, Ira Dorband, did a nice analysis of income distribution effects across countries. So she used this World Bank consumption database, which gives you quite nice aggregated household consumption patterns for 87 low-income countries or middle-income countries. So you know, okay, what do they consume? They consume like rice and fish and whatever you have. I mean, probably you know much more about this than I do. And then actually we can use input-output analysis to calculate carbon footprints for these households. And this actually allows us to say, okay, if we impose a certain carbon price, by how much would these households be affected? By what percentage? And here you need to take into account, this is a static analysis. So we're not taking into account any substitution effect. We're just asking how much money would we actually need to give this household to maintain the current consumption pattern with a carbon price in place. So basically you can understand this as something like an compensated variation. And the color coding here shows you how the lowest income group, the lowest quintile, performs to the national average. So if you have a number in excess of 1, means that the burden of the poorest is higher than the average, which means you have a regressive effect. And the redder it's getting, the more regressive it gets. And the green ones show you actually progressive outcomes. And this is quite encouraging. You only have very few countries where you find highly regressive results. For most countries, you find something like neutral, like these yellow countries, or even progressive, the green ones. But there's also one important thing that's, in my view, often a bit overlooked in this debate. Whether the tax or the carbon price is progressive or regressive is, of course, just one aspect. So the absolute effects also matters. And if you're a poor household and you lose 5% of your income, it doesn't help you much to know that the rich are losing even more. I mean, there's a huge loss, and that really puts massive burden on people. So we also looked at the absolute effect, assuming a carbon price of $30, which is quite moderate. I mean, way below of the social cost of carbon, way below of what we need to actually achieve like the 2-degree targets. And there you see that in some countries you could have quite substantial impacts on the poorest quintile. Again, the color coding, and like for instance, this light orange is like 2 to 2.5%, and the red is 3.5 to 5.5%, like in South Africa, Mongolia. So this would actually be something that you really need to take into account when you design such schemes to really prevent that poor people are losing out massively, because this would not be acceptable from a development perspective. And of course, it seems very unlikely that you could even implement such a scheme or keep it up for a long time if you're just like creating massive social discontent in people. So actually, one way to prevent such negative outcomes is to use the revenues get to actually compensate people. And of course, you can always make any outcome progressive. You can always actually give back to the poor more than they paid. You just have to do it in the right way, and you have to actually use the right tools. And this is what we're looking at. Let's start off with one study from my former colleague, David Kleinert. They looked at the different ways of revenue use in carbon pricing schemes. It's quite interesting that there are so many ways actually to use the revenues. I mean, you can just either give into the general budget, or you can use carbon pricing revenues for green spending. It's quite interesting that this is, in many surveys, this comes out as the preferred option, that many people don't really understand the carbon price by itself already actually helps to protect the climate. They think, okay, if you have a carbon tax, you need to actually invest the revenues to support renewable energies, otherwise it's no use. And I don't know what it follows from this, whether you should explain more what actually an environmental tax does, or if you should just follow this rule even if it doesn't make so much economic sense. Other things that are often mandated, like a uniform lump sum transfer, again, economically, that's not so reasonable, because the best thing, of course, we do is to lower other distortionary taxes. If you just give back the money, you still have the marginal cost of public funds on other taxation. But also this uniform lump sum transfer apparently has helped a lot to get the buy-in of people. Like Switzerland has done this, and people receive like a check in the mail every, I don't know if it's monthly or yearly, but this actually helps to understand oh yeah, climate policy is good. I get like, I don't know what they get, like 500 francs or whatever. So it must be a good thing. And yeah. And other things, of course, you could cut taxes, for instance, on payroll taxes, but also company taxes. So of course, you also need to somehow protect firms from negative impacts to kind of avoid that you have massive job losses. And all these approaches have different advantages and disadvantages in terms of efficiency, equity, and also accessibility. So basically, I think there's not like one best approach. It very much depends on the kind of political situation, the institutional framework, also, yeah, what kind of other issues you want to achieve with the tax, the revenues. So we've done some concrete studies how this could actually play out with a case study in Ecuador. So we first looked at the current subsidies. As you might know, Ecuador is a petro state, basically. They have huge fossil fuel subsidies, mostly in oil products, because they're a big oil producer, and oil is sold way below world market price. This, of course, constitutes a kind of subsidy, because it's a revenue that if you sell the oil, you had a lot of money that you could spend on whatever you want. And actually, the argument is often, okay, we do this to actually help the poor, that they need cheap energy for the housing and so on. But if you look at the distribution, you find that actually the lion's share of these subsidies goes to the richest people, especially for gasoline. Like half of the gasoline subsidies actually accrue to the richest 20% of the population. And there are also some estimates, how much money do you need to spend on subsidies to bring $1 to the lowest quintile? And that's like, depending on the subsidy, between $50 and $20. So this is a very inefficient way to actually help the poor. For LPG, liquefied petroleum gas, it's a little bit different. That's quite evenly distributed across income groups. So it's used quite a lot for cooking especially, but also heating, and also quite a lot by poorer people. We have used this, again, based on household data, input-output, to calculate distribution impacts for the subsidies on diesel, electricity, gasoline, and LPG. And there you see 3 scenarios. The scenarios, low, middle, and high, denote the global oil price. So of course, if you say, okay, the subsidy is basically price cap, you need to know which price you're talking about. And we have just used different historical values. And you also see like the solid bars and the white bars. And this is like direct effects and the indirect effects. So direct effects mean by direct use. And indirect effects means through the channel of good production. So for instance, diesel would have almost no direct effects because in Ecuador, hardly anyone has a diesel car. It only actually concerns good prices. Goods are transported by lorries that use diesel, and this would increase, the diesel price increase would actually affect people by means of mostly food price increases. And for LPGs, the other way around, like LPGs almost exclusively used directly and not much as a production input. And you also see, if you compare across quintiles, that actually the gasoline subsidy removal would be highly progressive, that actually the richest people would pay much more. They would actually lose about, in this high scenario, 3 to 4% of the income, whereas the poorest, for the poorest one, only 1.5%. And for diesel, it's slightly regressive. Electricity is about neutral, and LPG would actually be very regressive. So the poorest would lose in this high scenario about 4% of the income if you abolished LPG subsidies, and the richest only about 1%. So we actually looked at a lot of different scenarios, and I just want to mention 3 here, what you could do to actually spend the revenues. So actually, the first one would be, you always see here the red areas are the uncompensated effects. So this distributional impacts I just showed you, and this always uses this median scenario for the prices. And the green bars show the compensation. And this upper panel, so we only do this here as an example for diesel subsidies, but in the paper we do it also for gasoline, for electricity, and so on. I just don't want to make these slides too busy. So this actually would show you if you scaled up the existing social transfer scheme. So they have a scheme called the Bono de Desarrollo Humano, which actually gives people who are below a certain threshold some cash transfers. And this option assumes that those people who already receive it just receive more of it. So this would actually give the lowest quintile a net benefit of about 3% of the income. Like the second quintile would actually be neutral, and the higher quintiles, third, fourth, and fifth would actually lose about 2% of the income. And this number here shows how much money do you have left. So you have 600 millions of revenues, and to actually achieve this scenario, you only need about half of it, and the other half would be actually available for the government budget. And for Ecuador, debt relief would of course be a huge issue. And the second thing we looked at is to actually expand the Bono de Desarrollo to other people who are not yet receiving it. So you say, okay, we actually increase the threshold. It's not like, okay, let's say now it's like $200 per month and we increase it to $250. I don't know the exact numbers. This actually means that many people who are like in the second and third quintile would gain quite substantially. So net gains would be like about 4% of their income, whereas the losses mostly accrue to the fourth and fifth quintile. And finally, this could be very significant with a new channel, a minimum pension, saying people a certain age and below a certain income receive a pension. And their actually lowest income quintile could gain almost 8 or 9% of their income. So this would be a massive gain if you did that. So moving on, we did a similar approach for Nigeria. We also looked at carbon pricing and revenues, but we didn't look at cash transfers or tax reductions, but we did look at infrastructure investments. So we looked what happened if Nigeria implemented a carbon price of $30 and used these revenues to expand access to water, to sanitation, to electricity, and telecommunication. And of course, the main challenge there is to give a monetary value to these infrastructures. And what we do is to simply calculate that a household who gains access, let's say to electricity, is accounted as receiving like the costs of the electricity access. Of course, the benefits could be much higher and people would have actually a much higher willingness to pay, but you cannot account for that. So probably this could even be regarded as a lower bound estimate of the potential. It's quite interesting to note that, well, Nigeria is on paper not a poor country. They have massive oil revenues, but the human development prospects are really gloomy. I mean, here you see 10 to 30% of the population lack access to clean water, 45% don't have access to electricity grid, and so on. Inequality is incredibly high, and so on. So, yeah, to actually use carbon pricing revenues to grant people access to those very basic infrastructures could be something that could really be of interest. Again, we use household data, we match them to GTAB IO data, and then do some kind of micro simulation for the distributional impacts. Here, on this slide, you see just the uncompensated effects of the carbon tax, again, assuming $30 per ton of CO2, and also assuming that existing fossil fuel subsidies are abolished. And here you find that, especially in rural areas, this would have a somehow progressive effect. So the poorest people in rural areas would pay less than 1% on average, whereas the richest would pay more than 2%. And what's also interesting, and I will allude to that a little bit later, that you see there's a lot of spread actually in all quintiles. And actually the within income differences are much more pronounced than differences across quintiles. So you see that there are actually, even though the overall mean effect isn't so high, there are some people who lose out massively, who here, for instance, would lose more than 5% of their income. And I think it's very important to understand who these people are and what you could actually do to protect them. And maybe I'll just finish this slide. In urban settings, it's a little bit different. It's still progressive. The richest pay more, but the poor, even the poorest in urban areas, use at least some energy because they also at least have access to the electricity grid, or they use some public transport and so on. And even the spread, especially for the higher quintiles, are even more pronounced than for rural areas. Terry, you had a question?
What's driving the differences in impacts within income groups? What are you conditioning on? And what's the heterogeneity within income group that you observe?
I mean, these are many things. I mean, it's basically consumption patterns. We have consumption patterns for households. Gotcha. So we look at every individual household, and yeah, I mean, a lot of difference is connected to vehicle ownership. Car use makes all the difference. And then there are always some people who actually, despite being poor, use quite a lot of energy. So for instance, in some areas, there are farmers who use tractors and they consume quite a lot of gasoline or diesel. Yeah, it also might depend on lifestyles. There are certain people who, despite being poor, have an AC or a fridge.
Yeah, okay. Actually, a related question that's tied to that. I don't know how to think about this, or maybe people think about it or not, but most of what you're looking at is the progressivity of the tax given current consumption patterns, say, but presumably from the perspective of a poor person, sort of aspirational upward mobility is a huge deal. Like the ability to get access to a refrigerator or freezer or whatever it is. And I can imagine that, I don't know if there's any way to quantify that or to think about that or integrate that into thinking about the regressivity of a tax.
Yeah,
in the
that's
sense that it can stunt upward mobility or keep someone from, in a way that could have huge welfare impacts on their family or something.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I mean, we are just about to start research on that. One of our colleagues has done a master thesis where he looks at patterns of appliance ownership as a function of socioeconomic characteristics across countries and so on, to kind of understand how actually people shift towards these. And this also, of course, is quite interesting to note that, this shift could actually be accelerated by carbon pricing, and that people might actually either not have things that are really important, like, I mean, having a fridge or so is important per se, or that are important for kind of social inclusion. That even if it's not so important to have, it's still important to be part of society, because as like a middle class person, you need to have a car or you need to have an AC or whatever, and these things can carry actually quite a lot of meaning, I think, in a social context.
Michael, there's one question in the chat. I don't know if you saw that one.
Yeah,
but
just let's go. Yeah, definitely.
Basically, just saying if it was how depending is the effect on the $30 itself. If we double the $30 to 60, or if we half it, I'm assuming to 15, do we see double the effects or half of the effects that we see right now on that slide?
Yes. So that's a static thing, and we don't do any kind of elasticities shifting between income, between consumption. So it's perfectly linear. If you double the carbon price, you double the numbers here. Yeah. Okay, so here it's a kind of busy slide, and we're still working on it. But this kind of shows the effects of then using the revenues to invest in infrastructure. So the first one would be actually the pure carbon tax without compensation. So of course, everybody loses from that. But then the other bars show the include the positive aspects of receiving, let's say, access to electricity, like the green bars. And of course, this would be most pronounced for poorer households. Like for richer households, they don't benefit that much from the expansion of electricity because they already have access. So they wouldn't actually have any benefit from this. They would have access from some things. I mean, if you look at lump sum transfers, everybody would have at least some benefit. But of course, this would be the purple thing here. The poorest would, of course, gain most relative to the income because, the same money divided by a lower income, of course, is a higher percentage of their income. So even the lump sum transfers would on average be like something about 7-8% for the poorest people. And if you actually put it in things for which poor people don't have a lot of access, so for instance, your telecommunication, the people could gain massively, and some would gain amounts could amount to something even more than 20 or 30% of their current income. Yes, Stefan, you had a question?
Yeah, so I mean, isn't this slide compared to the previous one of the heart of the problem? Maybe you will come back to that when it comes to political feasibility. I remember from the Klennert et al. Paper that corruption is obviously a big factor in whether we should adopt anything like that or not. And on the previous slide, all the numbers were negative. So the effect on total consumption, if you forget about the environmental benefits and all that, it's all negative, and it's only becoming positive because we're using the money wisely. And well, if you think your government is highly corrupt, then you just don't see that we can get from the previous slide to this slide. And so you are against it, right?
Yeah, that's one of the main issues, that you really need to have good governance. You need to actually have the right incentives in place. And for instance, in Ecuador, I talked to many people asking them on their take of fossil fuel subsidies, and they always told me, okay, yeah, I understand that I don't get much from it, but at least it's like it's something. And if the government has this money, it will just end up on a Swiss bank account or be just wasted on some white elephant projects. So basically what we're doing is we're not saying, okay, this is the way to go, but rather we would like to show the potential, what you could do if you could ensure that the money is spent wisely.
Yeah. How do you put values on sanitation provision or
just the costs of provision? So to say, well, I mean, there are actually estimates. We use mostly estimates from the World Health Organization. How much does it cost to provide one household with access to sanitation? And this is actually different country groups. So usually you have the ballpark, like for water sanitation, of like something around $100, I think, per person. So if you give one person access to sanitation, we treat this in the same way as we would treat a $100 check, actually.
Okay, thank you.
So yeah, talking about substitution effects, this is really a very tricky issue because if you increase energy prices because fossil fuel becomes more expensive, of course, people would somehow substitute. But it's not so easy to understand which way they substitute because, of course, you have price elasticities, but the way you actually have to look at it is not only the own price elasticity, but look at the whole demand system, take into account all cross-price elasticities. And there's a quite common approach in this literature, the so-called AIDS model, almost ideal demand system, or the QUADES, including quadratic terms, that has actually been around for quite some while. I always had heard of it, and this is the first time Ravi, one of our PhD students, Ravi Agarwal, used this with household data for Uganda. And the motivation for this research was mostly to understand whether carbon pricing could push people towards the use of digital biomass. So many countries, people are still using wood or charcoal for cooking. And this is not covered by a carbon price because even if it has carbon emissions, it's often gathered by themselves or traded informally. And then if you increase, let's say, the price for LPG, you have the danger that people would use more of these traditional biomass for heating, cooking, and so on. And this could have quite negative effects, mostly in health, because there's a lot of indoor air pollution. It might also have negative effects on forests because it's often harvested unsustainably. And here we look at a carbon price of $40 per ton of CO2, what this would do. So I don't want to go too much into technical detail. Again, using direct energy use and input-output, we can actually estimate a price increase. And then with the parameters, the elasticities from the almost ideal demand system, we can actually look at the demand changes. So on average, electricity demand would decline by about 20% with carbon price, kerosene demand by 13%, and so on. The good thing here is that fire would also decline. So this is kind of unexpected, but obviously has to do with substitution effects, that actually firewood and kerosene use in Uganda are somehow complements that apparently that's due to cooking behaviors, that people, if kerosene becomes more expensive, they switch to different foods, which also require less firewood to be used. And it would result in an increase in charcoal use by about 4%. So somehow in the same order of magnitude in the firewood. What's also important that you would actually find some changes in demand of certain food products. And I will come to this later on. We can actually look at the expenditure changes. So here we don't actually do it on quintiles or whatever, but we do it continuously for expenditure percentiles and see what these households at a certain point in the income distribution would actually need to expand to upkeep their consumption, or not their consumption, but to actually, after changing their consumption bundles, how much do they, how much less money do they have, or how much more do they have to expend? And here you see this is quite progressive, and the overall effect is not huge. So the even the richest people who are most affected only pay like a little bit more than 1% of their income. But again, you find a huge range, and the full range can go up to 5% of income. So there are some households that would be quite massively affected. So here comes one thing that's, I think, one of the major innovations of this paper, that we also look at the effects of food and calorie consumption for terciles here. So because of data quality, we cannot do quintiles, we only have to do terciles for rural and urban. So on the left panel, the dark blue is food consumption, and the light blue would be calorie intake. So basically, you know how consumption patterns would change, and then you can somehow put some numbers on, okay, you know, they would consume less meat and more vegetables and so on, and have some average values. And see that also here you find quite some spread. Some people would actually consume more food and have a higher calorie intake, but there are also some others who would actually lose massively. Like especially here, the poorest tercile in urban areas, some people here would lose more than 10% of calories because they would actually switch to other kinds of food which actually have less calories. And the same is true for protein and micronutrient intake. So again, here you find quite some spread with positive and negative effects. On average, quite not so far away from zero, but the spread is an important thing. Some people might reduce the protein micronutrient intake by more than 10%, and the protein intake by more than 5, 6, 7%. So this is really something to look out for. And I think you really need to understand exactly what these substitution effects would do to people and what you actually need to do to protect them, whether it's monetary transfers, whether it's kind of in-kind provision of food, or even exclude certain fossil fuels from carbon pricing. Kerosene doesn't account for a high share of carbon emissions. And if the best thing you can do to protect poor people is to exclude kerosene from carbon pricing, probably that's the way to go. And this is still an open debate, and especially development economists are usually not very much in favor of carbon pricing in such settings as Uganda. So to conclude, let me say a few things on horizontal equity, on alternative policy instruments, how to assess them, and regional disparities. We did one study, I don't want to say too much, about 8 countries in developing Asia, which account for the lion's share of coal capacity currently planned or under construction. And we look at different things. Here is one thing, horizontal equity, the equity between income groups. So again, we have each of these different distributions is one income expenditure quintile. Actually, you see that on average, they're not so far apart. And the overall effect of a carbon price, again, we use here $40, is like something like 2, 3, 4%, depending on the country and the income quintile. And you find that the spread is quite huge. That, again, in some countries, it's quite similar across income groups. Like here in Indonesia, they are basically all the same distribution. You find values from 0% up to 8%. On others, you have quite a high variation. So in Pakistan, the poorest income quintile is mostly concentrated towards the left. So most poor people only experience losses of less than 2%. whereas it's much more spread out for richer households. So this again shows us that there's a lot of heterogeneity in there that we need to look at and we need to address and better understand why people are affected in so different ways. Yeah, here I don't want to go into too much detail. This table basically shows us that the spread within quintiles is much more pronounced than across quintiles. So delta V means the vertical across quintiles between the highest and the lowest. And delta H1, 2, 3, and so on always means like the spread within a certain quintile, within the most affected, least affected in the first quintile, second, third, and so on. And this actually shows you the relationship between horizontal and vertical effects. And depending on whether you take the minimum or the maximum, you find that they are range from sometimes like 2, as that the horizontal difference is twice as large as the vertical difference, up to almost 14. So the case of India, if you take the difference within the highest quintile difference compared to the difference across the quintile medians, you find that it's much, much higher. It's 40 times higher. One other thing we do in this paper is to look at non-carbon pricing policies. So we took 2 carbon pricing policies, an international carbon price and a national carbon price. And we also took like any instrument that increases electricity prices, such as just a coal phase out or renewable portfolio standard. And we actually, because it's hard to compare apples and oranges, we just compare it with the relative distribution impact and normalize it to the impacts on the poorest quintile. So actually, again, an upward slope means that it's progressive, that the richest people pay most. And here actually you see that it's quite interesting that you don't only find different behaviors of progressivity or regressivity across countries, but also across policy instruments. So for instance, here if you look at Bangladesh, you find that the power sector instrument, like this coal phase out, would be the most progressive, that actually the richest are 2.5 times more affected than the poorest. But in Pakistan, you just find the opposite, that the carbon pricing would be actually the most progressive instrument, and that actually the power sector instruments would have a bigger impact on the richest, but only to a very low extent. And also, like if you look at India or Thailand or Turkey, you find that carbon pricing is, all these policies are regressive, but these power sector instruments are most regressive. And I think there's also something important to take into account, because many people think, okay, carbon pricing is regressive or carbon pricing has distribution effects. But of course, every policy, any policy you can imagine has some distribution effect, because somebody will have to pay the costs. So maybe it's just not as salient. Okay, final topic. Yeah, we have to come to an end. We did one study on India looking at the differences across Indian states. So the issue here is India has great renewable energy potential, solar, wind, and they're considering phasing out coal in the future. The problem here is that those areas that have a lot of coal here to the east are also the poorest areas. And these are the areas that don't have good, abundant renewable energy potentials. So the good solar and wind sites are all to the west, like Gujarat, Rajasthan, Maharashtra, those areas that are comparatively well off. And of course, that's kind of a contentious situation. If you take away things, economic activity from one state and create opportunities for another state, this can cause major upheaval. So we do different things. We use input-output data to look at distribution effects on households. We look at impacts on energy-intensive industries, how much would prices increase for energy-intensive industries. And we also look at employment losses in coal, and also, on the other hand, what kind of employment could be gained in renewables. So the left-hand side, this shows a summary of the disadvantageous conditions. So we actually sum them all up. So it's kind of, yeah, it's not very scientific, but it's, I guess it's helpful to also see, okay, just those states that have the most negative impacts are here marked in black or dark gray. So as you can imagine, these are states from the east that have a lot of coal, that are quite poor, that have but a high share of energy intensive industries. And then the favorable conditions like either progressive distribution impacts or actually lots of jobs in renewable energies are shown here. And these are actually many of those states in the west, like Gujarat, Maharashtra, and so on, as I said. And actually, if you overlay those, you can actually identify hotspots of winners and losers. And this shows that actually those poor states in the east would be states for which you actually need to actually create some alternative futures for an energy transition, because you would take away opportunities but not give much back. That's the main insight. So let me quickly wrap up what I tried to convey in this talk. Firstly, the many dimensions of distribution effects. So it's an issue across income groups, but also within income groups, between rural and urban people, between ethnic groups, between different regions, and so on. And these are many dimensions you need to take into account. Then we find the carbon pricing is progressive in poorer countries, but you also need to look at the absolute impact. So even if it's progressive, you need to make sure that poor people are not majorly affected. Then you need to also take into account that you cannot escape the adverse income effects or distribution impacts of carbon pricing by other command and control policies, because these also have costs. And carbon pricing has the additional advantage of creating revenues that you can always actually use to protect the most vulnerable people. So recycling schemes are a way to do that. If you look at the substitution effects, as we did for Uganda, it's important to take into account that it's not only about expenditures, but also very much can affect lifestyles, for example, food consumption, calorie intake, micronutrients, and so on. So future research, I think what's very promising to really look into depth of the different household characteristics that determine who's most affected. And as you already mentioned, to really look at the targeting mechanisms, because we know that often you have quite good transfer systems in place, but they don't really reach all the people who would actually be eligible, because maybe they don't have bank accounts, maybe they are not registered, maybe there's corruption. And I think if you could find a way to make sure that those who are most vulnerable also receive those transfers, you could actually go a long way towards making climate policy socially equitable. So much from my side. Thank you very much. And now hope to have some discussion. Yeah. Should I unshare my screen, or do you think I might?
Sure. Yeah, any questions?
I have a question. So that it seems like there's a lot of papers that are being summarized, right? Am I correct on this?
Yes.
Okay. So do you have, I'm curious, since you didn't have time, since you're summarizing all the papers, you've got a lot of data and a lot of analyses that you run. Are you doing this in one model, or do you have several models? I mean, the first was a meta-analysis, I know, but then others, it seems like you have, I saw GTAP in there, I saw input output, because that's a ton of work putting this all together.
It is, yes. Like what you basically do is you always need to get the household data, and then you need to work a lot on these data to clean them and fix so many different things like underreporting or adjusting for certain country-specific effects. And once you have those, you can actually map those sectors to the input-output data. And for the input-output, we usually rely on GTAP.
Okay, so
we have an infrastructure, of course, that you don't have to start from scratch all over again, but it's always some work to do, and it's not just pushing a button for new data sets.
Sure.
But yeah.
No, I have worked with GTAP a tiny bit, and added sectors to it, but it's still a ton of work.
It is, yes. And also, like, if you use the environmental extension, it's a bit tricky to get the energy use and carbon emissions right. So,
Yeah, right. So you use GTAP to come up with a carbon footprint for
yes, exactly.
a representative household for every country?
Yeah, for every household from which we have data. And
Huh.
usually these household surveys include like a few thousand households, and you know exactly what they consume. And then from GTAP, you can match this to the consumption items. So maybe usually you have to aggregate a little bit because the GTAP resolution is finer, is coarser. So I don't know exactly the GTAP sectors, but maybe you have something like food, and then you match everything like, in the household, you might have 20 different food items and you just lump them all together. And of course, you make an aggregation error, but probably, I guess it's not huge, the error you make.
Yeah. Okay. Seems like once you have that done in GTAP, there's a lot of sort of simulations you could run with it. And it sounds like you're doing that, but it's pretty neat.
Yeah. I mean, there are many things we would like to do in addition, like to identify different kinds of people, like have characteristic households, maybe some kind of cluster analysis to see who are actually those people at the top and the bottom of this distribution.
Yeah. Do you ever, I don't want to dominate the conversation, but I mean, one of the things that you're doing here is you're implementing a carbon tax, which will have benefits, which have distributions, right? I mean, that's what the integrated assessment models are getting at. And I wonder if somehow thinking about the distribution of addressing climate change